Today, Tech Talk is about benefits of using SAS over conventional CSS. In the agenda, we are going to discuss why we use SAS, variables in SAS, nesting and partials, and also we discuss about attributes. And finally, we are going to end the session with a small demonstration. So first we are going to look at why we use SAS. So SAS on its own can be fun and simple. But with the time, style sheets can get bigger, more complex, and harder to maintain. So SAS has a feature that does exist in CSS like Mixins, inheritance, and more capabilities that help us write robust and maintainable CSS. In some ways, you may think of SAS as a style sheet extension language because it extends the standard CSS capabilities by introducing the capabilities of a basic programming language to CSS. However, browsers do not understand SAS, so we call it a preprocessed language. In other words, SAS commands have to be translated into CSS. When we define styles in SAS, the SAS compiler will generate a CSS output that the browser can understand. Then CSS SAS syntax is CSS compatible, which means if you know CSS, you know SAS. Therefore, you don't have to spend hours and hours on start using SAS. So also there are large community support and documents available for SAS. And a good starting point is the official SAS documentation page. So let's go through some capabilities of SAS and its benefits over conventional CSS. So variables, SAS variables works in the same way as the variables in programming languages. Variables can define using the $mark as shown in the right image. Then variables can refer throughout the style sheet, reducing repetition and increasing maintainability. For example, there are two variables called font stack and primary color in the following SAS file. And these variables are used when defining the body style properties. Also, the same variables can be reused for other styles definitions as well. Then if you want to change the primary color across the application, we can do it in one place by updating the primary color variable. But if we use conventional CSS, we have to update all the places which have the color property. And also variables can be used to do complex math, library configuration, and many other tasks. Next one is nesting. Nesting allows CSS selectors to nest in the same way as HTML. In this example, UL, LI, and A selectors are nested inside the now selector in the SAS code. But in conventional CSS, rules are defined one by one, repeating the now selector in each CSS rule. And therefore, nesting provides more natural syntax, which is easier and faster to read and understand. Then let's move on to partials. Partials provides a great way to organize the CSS code in different files. Partials are CSS files that contain a small CSS code specific for a particular styling separated from this main style sheet. Then these files can be used in other SAS files instead of writing the same styles again. To create a partial in SAS, the style sheet name should always start with underscore character. For example, underscore header.scss. This underscore character indicates that this is a small part of CSS. So there is no need to compile this into a CSS independently. Then let's move on to attributes. Attributes are CSS statements that instruct a CSS how to behave. As you can see, attributes begin with the @ sign. Let's look at the benefits of a few attributes in SAS. Mixins. Mixin is a code block that allows to write styles in it and use it throughout the project. We can also think of it as a reusable component, which helps write cleaner code, avoiding repetition. In this example, we want to display container and row as flex elements. To make that display and flex direction properties need to be defined in each element, as shown in the conventional CSS file. But in SAS, we can create a mixin with both the properties and include the mixin for all the components in one line, as shown in the example. Let's move on to the inheritance. When designing a web page, there are often cases where one class should have all the styles of another class and its own specific styles. And we can use at extend rule in SAS to achieve this behavior. So, which allows us to share a set of CSS properties from one selector to another. So in this example, we need to define container and customer container classes. So the customer container class should contain all the properties defined in the container class with an additional property called border width. So in SAS, we can easily extend the properties, define the container to customer container using the at extend rule as shown in the example. But in conventional CSS, we have to repeat the required properties in each class. So next one is at import. At import rule in SAS allows to include the content of one line to another, which helps to keep related code in separate files and combine it when required. So for example, we can create separate files for variables, colors and fonts, and then combine them using the add to import rule. Then, even though conventional CSS has the at import rule, it has performance issues since it creates a extra HTTP request each time we call it. In SAS, that limitation is not there since it combines everything during the compilation. So, however, the SAS teams now discourage the at import rule due to its own limitations. And they are planning to eventually replace the at input rule with at use and at forward rule. Then let's look at the at use. The new at use rule is similar to the at import rule explained above, but it has a few differences. The at use rule doesn't import private variables, mixins, functions. Also, members from the imported files are only available locally, which means those are not automatically passed for future imports. Then finally, as you can see in the example, when we use at use rule, SAS will automatically generate a namespace based on the file name. And this avoids the name conflicts and allows us to access members from both files using the namespace as shown in the example. Then, for example, if you want to access the color member defined in the button SCSS file, you can refer it as button.color. And next, we move on to the at forward rule. As I explained earlier, the at use rule doesn't automatically pass members for future imports. If you want to pass members for future imports, we should use the at forward rule. For example, let's say you want to combine multiple SAS files and libraries into one file and use that file as a single entry point file. And then you can achieve this by loading multiple files into a single file using the at forward rule, and then loading that single file using the at use rule as shown in the example. So let's look at the functions. Functions allows to define complex operations on SAS script values that can be reused throughout the style sheet and allows to abstract common formulas and behaviors in a readable way. For example, as shown here, we can define the weight function, which returns the font weight when the weight type is given. Then next, Suba will do a demonstration to show the usage of these capabilities in SAS. Thank you.
Thank you, Nimesha. So let's look into a small demonstration with using some features of SAS. So here I'm coming up with a simple HTML file and SAS to explain you all. So when we are developing a normal simple home page, this is the way we are having the normal HTML structure, and this is how we used to import all our HTML content related style files here. But when we are using SAS file, if I directly link the SAS file to the HTML file, it won't work. As I can show here, it won't take all the style when I directly link the SAS file to the simple HTML file. That is because, as Nimesha said, HTML files, or the browser can't read the SAS file directly. We have to compile them and give that SAS file as CSS to understand by the browser. So since I'm using a normal HTML file, we have to use some external extension to compile the SAS into CSS. So here I'm using Watch SAS compiler to do the needful, and because of using this Watch SAS, it will create a style.css file which contain all the styles which is related to this home page. So now what we have to do is we can directly link this CSS file to the HTML file and run. Now as we can see, all the styles are applied to the HTML file. But when we are using a React project or Angular project, we don't have to do this step. We don't have to compile using the external compilers, because already React and Angular projects have their own built-in compilers to compile the SAS files into CSS files. Let's move into the properties of SAS one by one. The first one I wanted to explain is the normal structure which we are having in the SAS. So as Nimesha said, if you know CSS, you know SAS. You don't have to study differently for writing SAS. So a valid CSS is a valid SAS. So as we seen here, normally if I wanted to write CSS style, for example, if I wanted to write for the specific element here for the inside a navbar, but I have to write is to write it specifically, I have to write this parent class navbar expand, and inside that I'll have a container class. Inside container class, I have to have specifically mention what are the classes there, navbar, collapse or collapse. So similar way, if I wanted to write this again and again, it's a hassle for us and it will take a lot of time as well. For example, now here I wanted to write some styling for this custom link, and I wanted to write it specifically to avoid conflicts. So what I have to do is again and again I have to call this parent class, then other children class, all the class again and again here. For example, even here if I wanted to write for custom item, I have to call all these class. I have to write all these classes again and again. But when I use SAS, what I simply have to use is I can use a nested structure. So this is called nested structure. So when we have navbar expand, then inside that we can have a container. Inside container we can have navbar nav. Inside that we are having custom item. So this is similar to the structure what we are having when we inspect it. So normally navbar expand, then container. Inside container we have navbar collapse. So same similar structure we can follow in the SAS also. This is a main property we should understand when we are writing SAS. It will help us to reduce our time spending on the code. And next main property, when we want to use SAS, we have to use variables. Variables means, so for example, I'm taking colors. So if I wanted to use a particular color code throughout the website, what I have to do in CSS is I have to copy paste each color code everywhere. For example, I'm using inside footer. Let's think I have to use the same color code in header also. Then again I have to remember this code, or again I have to go to the main file and copy this code and use it there. So it's a bit of a hassle, and we won't be remember like all the codes and related variables every time. So using these variables, what we can do is we can simply put the color code and using this $, and we can have whatever the names we prefer and define them to this code. Then all our the codes will be assigned to a naming. Similar way we can do it for font sizes, fonts, or whatever we wanted to define, even the resolutions and all, we can define them with a symbol name and we can use in other files. So for example, I have defined this green color code inside a $green variable. Now simply I just have to call this $green. I don't have to remember the code. I just have to call the $green. Automatically, my footer will change to the green color. So this is another main functionality or property of SAS. Another main feature of SAS is Mixins. So Mixins means, let's assume we are having codes that we are going to reuse it in all the pages, most of the pages. So if we are having that code component and if we have it again and again in the same page, it will occupy more space. The page will come along, and also we have to repeat the same code. Duplication of code also can occur. So to avoid that, using SAS, we can use mixin property and define those repeatable code inside. We can define a name and we can have our repeated code inside that, and we can reuse them in whatever the files we want. So for example, in this one specifically, I took media queries because usually we use a lot of media queries throughout our website when we wanted to do a responsive website. So we most of the time will use to all the files that we are going to use. So here what I define is, again I used variables to define all the resolution which I am going to use in this page. And what I did was, I'm using a @mixin keyword, and this naming we can give any names whatever we prefer. And here I'm just using a mobile just to indicate that I'm going to have all the mobile related media queries inside this. So after defining this, I simply have to have this media query, the normal notation like the way we are normally doing in CSS. We just have to call it here, and we have to have this @content keyword. Then only it will take all the content, whatever we are going to have it inside that media query, and it will render. So after I defining all these related media queries I can have for each and every resolution, then I just have to simply go to the page wherever I want to apply a media query. I have to simply do this and include mobile wording. So for example, if it is a CSS, I have to write the full media query. Here I just only have to call the @include mobile, and I have to define whatever the style I want to apply to this page. So here my footer got changed to gray color. So this is a great feature in SAS that we can use to reduce the repeatable code and reduce the length of the pages. Another main feature I wanted to explain is extend property. So let's think this is the page we are going to develop, and inside a page we may have similar components. So if we are having similar components, we don't have to write the codes again and again and repeat the codes. What we can simply do is we can define the common properties inside one, and we can inherit the properties to the others. For example, if I'm having a normal button class with a common features like common font sizes, font family, if I wanted to use the same font size, font family to these two buttons as well, I can simply come here and extend using extend keyword. I can call this button class here. So now all the button properties related to this class are inherited to these two buttons. So as we can see, these buttons are now with these properties. For example, if I wanted to change the font size, if I change that, it will get affected to these buttons as well. So this is also a very good feature in CSS that we can adapt throughout our website. And another function we have to consider is this import functions. So import rule in SAS, all this time all the developers were using @import, but nowadays because of the SAS team, they wanted to depreciate it, and because of having some limitations and input, so we are going to use @use and @forward in future. So this is simply what we'll do is this import. We can have all the partial values inside one value in one file, and use this one file inside a common page. So we don't have to come here and write all the files that are related to this page, and we don't have to list down and increase the length of the file. We can simply define them inside this common SAS file. We can simply import them and use it. Still, this import rule is applied inside when people are using old version of SAS. Still, this act import is in use, but maybe after some time it may be removed by the SAS team. So instead of import, we'll look how the use and forward working with the new version. Since this project is done using old version of SAS, I can't apply the use and forward in the old version. So I'm using this code sandbox to explain how the use and forward will work. So similar way, I have a separate variables file which contain all the color codes and Mixins which contain a media query. So if I wanted to use these variables to this button file, what I can use is like import. I also can use keyword like at use Mixins. That means I have to give a path here for the Mixin. So while I'm giving the path, it will automatically create a namespace for the path which we gave. So now, as we can see, if I give $blue like the way we did in normal SAS all this time, it won't work. That it's giving error. That's because when you are using at use, as I said, the namespace will get created. So what we have to do is, whenever we are defining a variable, we have to use that namespace dot, then that color code we have to use it. So for example, if it is in inside variable file, I am having a blue color. So that means variables is the namespace and dot $blue. This is introduced by the SAS team because maybe in a huge project we may have the same blue color code or same code in different files. So if I use this background color $blue without this name spacing, sometimes it may cause conflict. Sometimes the same code may be exist in different files also. So to avoid that only, this use at use property came with the name space. So if we if we think that some of us can think that it's a hassle to write every time we have to write this long name and all. So to avoid it, we even can define this long name as a simple one word or two word, and we can replace this here. So this also will work. And if we think that, okay, this also I don't want to use this as a separate, I don't want to use every time v.blue or v.white or whatever, then if we think only in one file we have all the color codes, only in one file we have all the style, then we can simply use this star to remove the namespace that is generated. Now what we can do is, we can simply call the $blue. So that is the usage of at use property. And another limit I wanted to say, another limitation in at use also, because let's think I'm having another file called all.sas. So here inside that I wanted to change this background color to white. So what I have, white or green. So what I have to do is, like in import, I may think I can simply import this at use property because already mixins and variables are imported. So I may think that it will work inside this alt also. So let's try by adding color. So as we can see here, it's saying undefined variable. That is because, not like in import, at use won't work in separate files. These are globally enabled only to that specific file, not to the outer file. So if I wanted to use these variables, what I have to do is, I have to import again these variables inside this file. So that is a limitation in at use property. So each and every file, even if I wanted to use another file, there also I have to import at mixin and at variables again. So maybe this may be a hassle for every one of us. Let's think if we have a huge project and if we are going to have a lot of partial files we wanted to import, we can't import each and every file with lot of files. So it may take time, sometimes we may miss it also. So for that, we have another add rule function called add forward. So what will this add forward will do is, it will, whatever we mentioning here inside add forward, it will suck all the files name, and it, when we use it inside another file using add use, it will spit out all the files that it suck. So for example, I have mixin and variable. So inside I have created a normal file and I used add forward keyword and use these mixins and variables. So after using this, now all the files are sucked by the forward keyword. Now if I wanted to use this in this file, what I have to use is, I have to simply use add use forward method. So even if I wanted to have lot of files also, I can simply call them inside this and I can use them inside forward function. So that's all for use and forward, and this is the end of the demo. And you can refer these links if needed. This is the official SAS documentation page and this is the community page. So if any doubts, if anybody want to learn, these are the good links to learn. And if any doubts they are related to SAS, you all can reach me or Nimesha anytime. Thank you for listening.